Home Movies, Part 2. So far in this chapter, we've talked about two factors that fuel the power struggle. One, our partners make us feel anxious by stirring up forbidden parts of ourselves. Two, our partners have or appear to have the same negative traits as our parents, adding further injury to old wounds and thereby awakening our unconscious fear of death. Now there is a third and final aspect of the power struggle that deserves our attention. In the previous chapter, I talked about the fact that many of our joyful feelings of romantic love come from projecting positive aspects of our imago onto our partners. In other words, we look at our partners and see all the good things about mom and dad, and all the good but repressed parts of our own being. In the power struggle, we keep the movie projectors running, only we switch reels and begin to project our denied negative traits. In Chapter 2, I defined these denied negative traits as the disowned self. If you will recall, I talked about the fact that all people have a dark side to their nature, a part of their being that they try to ignore. For the most part, these are creative adaptations to childhood wounds. People also acquire negative traits by observing their parents. Even though they may not like certain things about their parents, they introject these traits through a process called identification. A father's judgmental nature and a mother's tendency to belittle herself, for example, become traits passed on to the children. But as the children become more self-aware, they recognize that these are the very traits they dislike in their parents, and they do their best to deny them. Now, this is where it gets interesting. Not only do the children manifest these negative traits themselves, although disowned and thus out of awareness, but when they grow up, they also look for these traits in potential mates, for they are an essential part of their imagos. The imago is not only an inner image of the opposite sex, it is also a description of the disowned self. A case history might help you understand this curious and complex psychological phenomenon. I spent many years working with a young woman named Lillian. Lillian's parents divorced when she was 9 years old, and her mother gained custody of both Lillian and her 12-year-old sister, June. A year after the divorce, her mother married a man who did not get along with June. The stepfather yelled at her constantly, punishing even the smallest transgression. Several times a week, his rage would escalate, and he would take the girl into her room and spank her with a belt. Lillian would stand outside the door, listening to the blows from the belt, and shaking with anger and fear. She detested her stepfather. Yet, to Lillian's dismay, when she was left alone with her sister, she began to treat her with almost equal disdain. She would even call her some of the very same hurtful names she heard her stepfather use. The fact that she was capable of hurting her sister was so painful to Lillian that she repressed these episodes. It was only after a year of therapy that she could remember those times, and it was even longer before she trusted me enough to tell me about them. When she did, I was able to help her see that it was human nature for her to absorb both the positive and the negative traits of her stepfather. He was the dominant influence in the household, and her unconscious mind registered the fact that the person who was most angry happened to be the most powerful. Anger and derision, therefore, must be a valuable survival skill. Gradually, this character trait wormed its way into Lillian's basically kind nature. When Lillian grew up and married, it was inevitable that she would fall in love with someone who had some of her stepfather's characteristics, notably his violent anger, because this was the part of him that had been so threatening to her. In fact, the reason she came in for therapy was that her husband had physically abused her. After 2 years of therapy, she was able to see that the anger she had found so detestable in her stepfather was one of the unconscious factors behind her attraction to her husband, and even more alarming, was also a denied part of her own personality. This particular imago trait, therefore, was not only a description of her husband, but also a description of a disowned part of herself. I see a similar tendency in virtually every love relationship. People try to exorcise their denied negative traits by projecting them onto their mates. Or to put it another way, they look at their partners and criticize all the things they dislike and deny in themselves. Taking a negative trait and attributing it to their partners is a remarkably effective way to obscure a not-so-desirable part of the self. Now we have defined the 3 major sources of conflict that make up the power struggle. As the illusion of romantic love slowly erodes, the 2 partners begin to 1. Stir up each other's repressed behaviors and feelings. 2. Re-injure each other's childhood wounds. 3. Project their own negative traits onto each other. All of these interactions are unconscious. All people know is that they feel confused, angry, anxious, depressed, and unloved. And it is only natural that they blame all this unhappiness on their partners. They haven't changed. They're the same people they used to be. It's their partners who have changed. Weapons of love. In despair, people begin to use negative tactics to force their partners to be more loving. They withhold their affection and become emotionally distant. They become irritable and critical. They attack and blame. Why do you always? How come you never? They fling these verbal stones in a desperate attempt to get their partners to be warm and responsive, or to express whatever positive traits are in their imagos. They believe that if they give their partners enough pain, the partners will return to their former loving ways. What makes people believe that hurting their partners will make them behave more pleasantly? Why don't people simply tell each other in plain English that they want more affection or attention or lovemaking or freedom or whatever it is they are craving? I asked that question out loud one day as I was conducting a couples workshop. It wasn't just a rhetorical question. I didn't have the answer. But it just so happened that a few minutes before, I had been talking about babies and their instinctual crying response to distress. All of a sudden, I had the answer. Once again, our old brains were to blame. When we were babies, we didn't smile sweetly at our mothers to get them to take care of us. We didn't pinpoint our discomfort by putting it into words. We simply opened our mouths and screamed. And it didn't take us long to learn that the louder we screamed, the quicker they came. The success of this tactic was turned into an imprint, a part of our stored memory about how to get the world to respond to our needs. When you are frustrated, provoke the people around you. Be as unpleasant as possible, until someone comes to your rescue. This primitive method of signaling distress is characteristic of most couples immersed in a power struggle. But there is one example that stands out in my mind. A few years ago, I was seeing a couple who had been married about 25 years. The husband was convinced that his wife was not only selfish, but also vindictive. "She never thinks of me," he complained, listing numerous ways his wife ignored him. Meanwhile, his wife sat in her chair and shook her head in mute disagreement. As soon as he was through, she leaned forward in her chair and said to me in a strong and earnest voice, "Believe me, I do everything I can to please him. I spend more time with him. I spend less time with him. I even learned how to ski this winter, thinking that would make him happy. And I hate the cold. But nothing seems to work." To help end the stalemate, I asked the husband to tell his wife one specific thing that she could do that would make him feel better. One practical, doable, measurable activity that would help him feel more loved. He hemmed and hawed, and then said with a growl, "If she's been married to me for 25 years and still doesn't know what I want, and she hasn't been paying any attention, she just doesn't care about me." This man, like the rest of us, was clinging to a primitive view of the world. When he was an infant lying in the cradle, he experienced his mother as a large creature leaning over him, trying to intuit his needs. He was fed, clothed, bathed, and nurtured, even though he could not articulate a single need. A crucial lesson learned in the pre-verbal stage of his development left an indelible imprint on his mind. Other people were supposed to figure out what he needed and give it to him without his having to do anything more than cry. Whereas this arrangement worked fairly well when he was a child, in adulthood, his needs were a great deal more complex. Furthermore, his wife was not a devoted mother hovering over his crib. She was an equal, with, much to his surprise, needs and expectations of her own. And although she wanted very much to make him happy, she didn't know what to do. Lacking this information, she was forced to play a grown-up version of Pin the Tail on the Donkey. Is this what you want? Is this? When partners don't tell each other what they want and constantly criticize each other for missing the boat, it's no wonder that the spirit of love and cooperation disappears. In its place comes the grim determination of the power struggle, in which each partner tries to force the other to meet his or her needs. Even though their partners react to these maneuvers with renewed hostility, they persevere. Why? Because in their unconscious minds, they fear that if their needs are not met, they will die. This is a classic example of what Freud called the repetition compulsion, the tendency of human beings to repeat ineffective behaviors over and over again. Some couples stay in this angry, hostile state forever. They hone their ability to pierce each other's defenses and damage each other's psyches. With alarming frequency, the anger erupts into violence. Stages of the power struggle. When you are immersed in the power struggle, life seems chaotic. You have no reference points. You have no sense of when it all started or how it will end. But from a distant perspective, the power struggle can be seen to follow a predictable course, one that happens to parallel the well-documented stages of grief in a dying or bereaved person. But this death is not the death of the real person. It's the death of the illusion of romantic love. First comes the shock, that horrifying moment of truth when a window opens and a wrenching thought invades your consciousness. This is not the person I thought I had married. At that instant, you assume that married life is going to be a continuation of the loneliness and pain of childhood. The long-anticipated healing is not to be. After the shock comes denial. The disappointment is so great that you don't allow yourself to see the truth. You do your best to see your partner's negative traits in a positive light. But eventually, the denial can no longer be sustained, and you feel betrayed. Either your partner has changed drastically since the days when you were first in love, or you have been deceived all along about his or her true nature. You are in pain, and the degree of your pain is the degree of the disparity between your earlier fantasy of your partner and your partner's emerging reality. If you stick it out beyond the angry stage of the power struggle, some of the venom drains away, and you enter the fourth stage, bargaining. This stage goes something like this. If you will give up your drinking, I will be more interested in sex. Or, if you let me spend more days sailing, I will spend more time with the children. Marriage therapists can unwittingly prolong this stage of the power struggle if they help couples negotiate behavioral contracts without getting to the root of the problem. The last stage of the power struggle is despair. When couples reach this final juncture, they no longer have any hopes of finding happiness or love within the relationship. The pain has gone on too long. At this point, approximately half the couples withdraw the last vestiges of hope and end the relationship. Most of those who stay together create what is called a parallel relationship and try to find all their happiness outside the partnership. A very few, perhaps as few as 5% of all couples, find a way to resolve the power struggle and go on to create a deeply satisfying relationship. For the sake of clarity, I would like to reduce the discussion in these 5 chapters to its simplest form. First of all, we choose our partners for 2 basic reasons. 1, they have both the positive and the negative qualities of the people who raised us. And 2, they compensate for positive parts of our being that were cut off in childhood. We enter the relationship with the unconscious assumption that our partner will become a surrogate parent and make up for all the deprivation of our childhood. All we have to do to be healed is to form a close, lasting relationship. After a time, we realize that our strategy is not working. We are in love, but not whole. We decide that the reason our plan is not working is that our partners are deliberately ignoring our needs. They know exactly what we want and when and how we want it, but for some reason they are deliberately withholding it from us. This makes us angry, and for the first time we begin to see our partner's negative traits. We then compound the problem by projecting our own denied negative traits onto them. As conditions deteriorate, we decide that the best way to force our partners to satisfy our needs is to be unpleasant and irritable, just as we were in the cradle. If we yell loud enough and long enough, we believe our partners will come to our rescue. And finally, what gives the power struggle its toxicity is the underlying unconscious belief that if we cannot entice, coerce, or seduce our partners into taking care of us, we will face the fear greater than all other fears, the fear of death. What may not be immediately apparent in this brief summary is this. There is really very little difference between romantic love and the power struggle. On the surface, these first two stages of a love relationship appear to be worlds apart. A couple's delight in each other has turned to hatred, and their goodwill has degenerated into a battle of wills. But what's important to note is that the underlying themes remain the same. Both individuals are still searching for a way to regain their original wholeness, and they are still holding on to the belief that their partners have the power to make them healthy and whole. The main difference is that now in the power struggle, the partner is perceived as withholding love. This requires a switch in tactics, and the two people begin to hurt each other or deny each other pleasure and intimacy in hopes of having their partners respond with warmth and love. What is the way out of this labyrinth of confusion? What lies beyond the power struggle? In the next chapter, Becoming Conscious, we will talk about a new kind of relationship, the conscious partnership, and show how it helps two people in a love relationship begin to satisfy each other's childhood longings. Part 2. The Conscious Partnership. Chapter 6. Becoming Conscious. From C.G. Jung. Seldom or never does a marriage develop into an individual relationship smoothly, without crisis. There is no birth of consciousness without pain. Scanning the first 5 chapters, it would be easy to get the impression that the old brain is the cause of most of our relationship problems. It's the old brain that prompts us to choose partners who resemble our caretakers. It's the old brain that is the source of all our elaborate defenses, the projections, transferences, and introjections that obscure the reality of ourselves and our partners. And it's the old brain that is responsible for our infantile response to frustration, the cry or criticize response that causes further alienation. But the old brain also plays a positive role in love relationships. Although some of the tactics of the old brain may be self-defeating, its fundamental drives are essential to our well-being. Our unconscious drive to repair the emotional damage of childhood is what allows us to realize our spiritual potential as human beings, to become complete and loving people capable of nurturing others. And even though our projections and transferences may temporarily blind us to our partner's reality, they're also what binds us to them, setting up the preconditions for future growth. The problem with the old brain is that it's unguided. It's like a blind animal trying to find its way to the watering hole. To achieve the valid and important objectives of the old brain, we need to enlist the aid of the new brain, the part of us that makes choices, exerts will, knows that our partners are not our parents, that today is not always, and that yesterday is not today. We need to take the rational skills that we use in other parts of our lives and bring them to bear on our love relationships. Once we forge a working alliance between the powerful, instinctual drives of the old brain and the discriminating cognitive powers of the new brain, we can begin to realize our unconscious goals. Through the marriage of old brain instincts and new brain savvy, we can gradually leave the frustrations of the power struggle behind us. New brain, old brain merger. How would married life be different if the new brain played a more active role? Here's an example of a typical interaction between a husband and wife and how it might be handled in an unconscious partnership, a typical love relationship dominated by old brain reactivity, and in a conscious partnership, a relationship where the old brain is tempered by reason. Imagine that you are happily eating breakfast, and your spouse suddenly criticizes you for burning the waffles. Your old brain, the perpetual guardian of your safety, instantly prompts you to fight or flee. It cares not that the person who criticized you is your spouse. All it cares about is that you're under attack. Unless you interfere with your automatic old brain response, you will immediately return your partner's critical remark with a scathing rejoinder. Well, I may have burned the waffles, but you spilled the syrup. Or, on the other hand, you might attempt to flee the encounter altogether by leaving the room or burying your head in the newspaper. Depending on your approach, your partner will feel either attacked or abandoned and will most likely lash out again. A perpetual emotion machine will be set in gear, and you will have defeated the desired outcome, which is to have a pleasant, intimate breakfast together. This is precisely the kind of situation in which the new brain could be pressed into service to come up with a less provocative response. One approach, an approach that we will explore in detail in a later chapter, might be to paraphrase your partner's statement in a neutral tone of voice, acknowledging the anger, but not rushing to your own defense. For example, you might say something like this: "You're really upset that I burned the waffles again." Your partner might then respond, "Yes, I am. I'm tired of all the wasted food around here. Next time, be more careful." And still relying on new brain tact, you could respond once again in the same non-defensive manner. "You're right. Food does get wasted around here. I'll get an extension cord and bring the waffle iron into the dining room, where we can keep a closer eye on it." Your partner, disarmed by your rational tone of voice and your ability to think of an alternative solution, will probably calm down and become more tractable. "Good idea. And thanks for not getting upset. I guess I'm a little edgy this morning. I'm behind at work, and I don't know how I'm going to manage." Because you were willing to risk a creative response to anger, you have suddenly become a trusted confidant, not a sparring partner. Once you become skilled in this non-defensive approach to criticism, you will make an important discovery. In most interactions with your spouse, you are actually safer when you lower your defenses than when you keep them engaged, because your partner becomes an ally, not an enemy. By relying on your new brain, which, unlike your old brain, recognizes that being criticized for burning the waffles is not the same thing as being attacked with a bread knife, you learn to moderate your instinctual fight-flight response. Paradoxically, you do an even better job of satisfying the underlying purpose of this automatic defense, which is to keep yourself safe and unharmed. This is only one example of how greater reliance on the flexibility and discriminating powers of the conscious brain can help you achieve your unconscious goals. Let's move on to the larger picture and get a comprehensive view of what I mean by a conscious partnership. Let's start with a definition. A conscious partnership is a relationship that fosters maximum psychological and spiritual growth. It's a relationship created by becoming conscious and cooperating with the fundamental drives of the unconscious mind: to be safe, to be healed, and to be whole. What are some of the differences when you become conscious? The following list highlights some of the essential differences in attitude and behavior. 10 characteristics of a conscious partnership. 1. you realize that your love relationship has a hidden purpose: the healing of childhood wounds. Instead of focusing entirely on surface needs and desires, you learn to recognize the unresolved childhood issues that underlie them. When you look at relationships with this X-ray vision, your daily interactions take on more meaning. Puzzling aspects of your relationship begin to make sense to you, and you have a greater sense of control. 2. You create a more accurate image of your partner. At the very moment of attraction, you began fusing your lover with your primary caretakers. Later, you projected your negative traits onto your partner, further obscuring your partner's essential reality. As you move toward a conscious relationship, you gradually let go of these illusions and begin to see more of your partner's truth. You see your partner not as your savior, but as another wounded human being, struggling to be healed. 3. You take responsibility for communicating your needs and desires to your partner. In an unconscious partnership, you cling to the childhood belief that your partner automatically intuits your needs. In a conscious partnership, you accept the fact that in order to understand each other, you have to develop clear channels of communication. 4. You become more intentional in your interactions. In an unconscious partnership, you tend to react without thinking. You allow the primitive response of your old brain to control your behavior. In a conscious partnership, you train yourself to behave in a more constructive manner. 5. You learn to value your partner's needs and wishes as highly as you value your own. In an unconscious partnership, you assume that your partner's role in life is to take care of your needs magically. In a conscious partnership, you let go of this narcissistic view and divert more and more of your energy to meeting your partner's needs. 6. You embrace the dark side of your personality. In a conscious partnership, you openly acknowledge the fact that you, like everyone else, have negative traits. As you accept responsibility for this dark side of your nature, you lessen your tendency to project your negative traits onto your mate, which creates a less hostile environment. 7. You learn new techniques to satisfy your basic needs and desires. During the power struggle, you cajole, harangue, and blame in an attempt to coerce your partner to meet your needs. When you move beyond this stage, you realize that your partner can indeed be a resource for you once you abandon your self-defeating tactics. 8. You search within yourself for the strengths and abilities you are lacking. One reason you were attracted to your partner is that your partner had strengths and abilities that you lacked. Therefore, being with your partner gave you an illusory sense of wholeness. In a conscious partnership, you learn that the only way you can truly recapture a sense of oneness is to develop the hidden traits within yourself. 9. You become more aware of your drive to be loving and whole and united with the universe. As a part of your God-given nature, you have the ability to love unconditionally and to experience unity with the world around you. Social conditioning and imperfect parenting made you lose touch with these qualities. In a conscious partnership, you begin to rediscover your original nature. 10. You accept the difficulty of creating a lasting love relationship. In an unconscious partnership, you believe that the way to have a good relationship is to pick the right partner. In a conscious partnership, you realize you have to be the right partner. As you gain a more realistic view, you realize that a good relationship requires commitment, discipline, and the courage to grow and change. Creating a fulfilling love relationship is hard work. Let's take a closer look at number 10, the need to accept the difficulty involved in creating a good marriage. Because none of the other 9 ideas will come to fruition unless you first cultivate your willingness to grow and change. Becoming a lover. We all have an understandable desire to live life as children. We don't want to go to the trouble of raising a cow and milking it. We want to sit down at the table and have someone hand us a cool glass of milk. We don't want to plant seeds and tend a grapevine. We want to walk out the back door and pluck a handful of grapes. This wishful thinking finds its ultimate expression in relationships. We don't want to accept responsibility for getting our needs met. We want to fall in love with a superhuman mate and live happily ever after. The psychological term for this tendency to put the source of our frustrations and the solution to our problems outside ourselves is externalization, and it is the cause of much of the world's unhappiness. I remember the day when a client whom I will call Walter came in for his appointment with slumped shoulders and a sad expression. "What's the matter?" I asked Walter. "You look very unhappy today." "Harville," he said to me as he slumped into the chair, "I feel really terrible. I just don't have any friends." I was sympathetic with him. "You must be very sad. It's lonely not having any friends." "Yeah, I can't seem to, I don't know. There are just no friends in my life. I keep looking and looking, and I can't find any." He continued in a morose, complaining voice for some time, and I had to suppress a growing annoyance with his regressed, childlike state. He was locked into a view of the world that went something like this. Wandering around the world were people on whose foreheads were stamped the words, "Friend of Walter," and his job was merely to search until he found them. "Walter," I said with a sigh, "do you understand why you don't have any friends?" He perked up. "No, tell me." "The reason you don't have any friends is that there aren't any friends out there." His shoulders slumped. I was relentless. "That's right," I told him. "There are no friends out there. What you want does not exist." I let him stew in this sad state of affairs for a few seconds. Then I leaned forward in my chair and said, "Walter, listen to me. All people in the world are strangers. If you want a friend, you're going to have to go out and make one." Walter was resisting the idea that creating a lasting friendship takes time and energy. Even though he was responsible and energetic in his job, he retained the childlike notion that all he had to do to establish intimacy was to bump up against the right person. Because he hadn't acknowledged that a friendship evolves slowly over time and requires thoughtfulness, sensitivity, and patience, he had been living a lonely life. The passive attitude Walter brought to his friendships was even more pronounced in his love life. He couldn't seem to find the ideal woman. Recovering from a painful divorce and a bitter legal battle, his wife had gotten custody of their son. He was desperately trying to find a new lover. The specific problem that had plagued Walter in his relationship was that he was caught up in concepts and ideas, not feelings. He hid his vulnerability behind his formidable intellect, which prevented any genuine intimacy. He had been coming to group therapy sessions for about 6 months, and at each session, he would hear from the group the same message that he had been hearing from his wife, that he wasn't sharing his feelings, that he was emotionally distant. One evening, a member of the group finally broke through to him. "When you talk about your pain," she said, "I can't see any suffering. When you hug me, I can't feel your hugs." Walter finally realized that there was some basis to his ex-wife's complaints. "I thought she was just being bitchy and critical," he confessed. "It never occurred to me that maybe she was right, that I could learn something about myself from listening to her." When Walter had time to absorb this awareness, he developed more enthusiasm for the therapeutic process and was able to work on dismantling his emotional barriers. As he became more alive emotionally, he was finally able to have a satisfying relationship with a new woman friend. During his last session with me, he shared his feelings about therapy. "You know," he said, "it took me 2 years to learn one simple fact, that in order to have a good relationship, you have to be willing to grow and change. If I had known this 10 years ago, I would still be living with my wife and son." Walter can't be blamed for wanting to believe that marriage should be easy and natural. It's human nature to want a life without effort. When we were infants, the world withheld and we were frustrated. The world gave and we were satisfied. Out of thousands of these early transactions, we fashioned a model of the world, and we cling to this outdated model, even at the expense of our relationships. We are slow to comprehend that in order to be loved, we must first become lovers. And I don't mean this in sentimental terms. I don't mean sending flowers, writing love notes, or learning new lovemaking techniques, although any one of these activities might be a welcome part of a loving relationship. To become a lover, we must first abandon the self-defeating tactics and beliefs that I've discussed in the first 5 chapters, and replace them with more constructive ones. We must change our ideas about love relationships, about our partners, and ultimately about ourselves. The fear of change. Standing in the way of the changes we need to make in order to have a more satisfying relationship is our fear of change. A fear of change is also basic to human nature. We can feel anxious even when we're undergoing a positive change, such as getting promoted, moving into a new home, or going on vacation. Anything that breaks us out of our comfortable or not so comfortable routines sets off an alarm in our old brain. The old brain is alerting us to the fact that we are entering territory that has not been mapped or surveyed, and that danger may lurk around every corner. I see a wish to cling to well-worn paths, even in young children. When our daughter Leah was 2.5 years old, her younger brother, Hunter, had outgrown the bassinet, and Helen and I decided it was time to move her into a youth bed so that the baby could have the crib. The youth bed had a 6-inch rail going halfway down the bed to keep her from rolling off in the middle of the night. The bottom half had no rail. The first morning that Leah awoke in her new bed, we heard her familiar wake-up cry, "Daddy, Daddy, Mommy, Mommy." We went into her room, and there she was on her knees, with her hands on the little rail, saying, "Pick me up," just as she had done in her old crib with the 2-foot sides. We were taken aback by her helplessness. She could easily have climbed over the bar or scooted down a few feet to the part of the bed that had no railing at all. "Leah," I said with enthusiasm, You can get out of your new bed all by yourself." "I can't," she said, sticking out her lower lip. "I'm stuck." "Leah, look down here," I implored, patting the part of the bed without rails. "You can climb down right here." She knelt, frozen in place. Finally, I had to get up on the bed with her and show her how to do it. With our encouragement, she was able to follow close behind us, overcome her resistance to change, and get out of bed. I once saw a more dramatic demonstration of paralysis in the face of change while watching the evening news. A local TV station carried a story about a little boy who had been born with severe immune deficiency, and from the moment of birth had to spend his life encased in a plastic bubble, sealed off from life-threatening germs. His devoted mother and father were by his side every day of his life, but they were separated from him by the plastic, and the only way they could touch him was by putting on long, sterile gloves that were permanently inserted into the bubble. Shortly after the boy's 5th birthday, he was given a successful bone marrow transplant, and after elaborate testing, the doctors decided that his immune system was sufficiently developed to allow him to leave his sterile world. On the day he was scheduled to come out, the bubble was slit open, and his overjoyed mother and father held out their arms to him. This was the first time in their lives that they would be able to kiss and hug their son. But to everyone's surprise, the boy cowered in the back of the bubble. His parents called to him, but he wouldn't budge. Finally, his father had to crawl inside and carry him out. As the little boy looked around the room, he started to cry. Since he had lived all his life in a 10 by 8 foot enclosure, the room must have looked enormous to him. His parents hugged him and kissed him to reassure him, but he wasn't used to any physical contact, and he arched backward to escape their embraces. The closing segment of the story, filmed a few days later, showed that the child was growing more comfortable with life outside the bubble. But on the day of his emancipation, it was clear that his fear of confronting the unfamiliar was stronger than his desire to explore the world. That little boy lived for 5 years inside his bubble. The couples that come to me have been living for 2, 10, 20, as many as 40 years inside a restrictive, growth-inhibiting relationship. With so many years invested in habituated behaviors, it's only natural that they should experience a great reluctance to change. After all, I am asking them not only to risk the anxiety of learning a new style of relating, but also to confront the pain and fear that have been bottled up inside them for decades. The reason for their dysfunctional behavior in the first place. The Promised Land. To give you some insight into the difficulties of creating a conscious partnership, I want to recount my highly abridged version of the story of Moses and the Promised Land, which I view as a parable of the human psyche. It goes like this. Many centuries ago, the Israelites were a great tribe of people living in a country near the Mediterranean Sea. There came a drought to their land, and in order to survive, the Israelites migrated south to Egypt, where the bins were full of grain. But in exchange for the grain, they were forced to become slaves to the Egyptians and were subjected to cruel treatment and the dreary labor of making bricks without straw. After more than 400 years of this meager existence, along came a man named Moses, who said to the Israelites, "Good grief, you're going through painful, repetitive behavior that is getting you nowhere. You've forgotten your heritage. You're not slaves of the house of Egypt. You are the children of the great God Yahweh. The God of all gods is your creator, and you are his special people. Moses' words stirred a sense of recognition in the Israelites, and they became aware of their mental imprisonment. This made them restless and unhappy, not unlike many of the couples that come to me for counseling. Lured by a vision of the promised land, the Israelites followed Moses. But the Israelites were not prepared for the hardships of the journey, and they had little faith in God's protection. When they came to the first obstacle, the Red Sea, they complained bitterly to Moses. "You got us out of our comfortable huts with a promise of a better way of life. Now our way is blocked by an enormous sea. Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What are we to do?" Moses himself wasn't sure what to do, but he believed that if he had faith, a way would appear. While he was pondering their fate, a huge dust cloud appeared on the horizon. To the Israelites' horror, they realized it was a cloud kicked up by thousands of rapidly approaching Egyptian soldiers coming to capture them and return them to their chains. At this moment, Moses lifted his hand, and a strong east wind miraculously parted the Red Sea. Awed by this great miracle, the Israelites summoned their courage, took one last look back at Egypt, the only home they had known, and followed Moses fearfully into the watery chasm. There were walls of water to their right and to their left. When they were safely across the sea, Moses raised his hand once more, and the great sea walls collapsed, drowning all the Egyptians in a rushing torrent of water. The Israelites had only moments to celebrate their safe passage. As they looked at the new land, they were dismayed to learn that they had arrived on the edge of a barren, trackless desert. Once again, they cried out in anguish, "You disrupted our secure lives. You urged us to follow you on a long journey. We were almost captured by the Egyptians. We were nearly drowned in the Red Sea. And now we are lost in a barren land with no food or water." Despite their fears, the Israelites had no choice but to continue. They wandered for many months in the foreign land, guided by a pillar of cloud by day and by a pillar of fire by night. They encountered great hardships, but God was merciful and made their burden lighter by performing miracles. Finally, the Israelites arrived at the end of the desert. "Just over the ridge," said Moses, "was the promised land." Scouts were sent ahead to survey the territory. But when the scouts returned, they brought more bad news. The promised land really does flow with milk and honey, but it is already occupied. This is the home of the Canaanites, gigantic creatures 7 feet tall. The listening crowd cried out in terror and once again yearned for the safety and security of their life in Egypt. At this point, God spoke to them. "Because you have no faith, and because you keep remembering Egypt, you have to wander in the desert for 40 years, until a new generation arises that does not remember the old ways. Only then can you go into the promised land." So for 40 more years, the Israelites camped out in the desert. Children were born and old people died. Finally, a new leader arose to take them into Israel, to begin the hard work of wresting the land from the Canaanites. What can we learn from this familiar story that will help us in our exploration of love relationships? One of the first truths we can learn is the fact that most of us go through married life as if we were asleep, engaging in routine interactions that give us little pleasure. Like the Israelites in their 400 years of servitude to the Egyptians, we have forgotten who we are. In the words of Wordsworth, we come into the world trailing clouds of glory, but the fire is soon extinguished, and we lose sight of the fact that we are whole spiritual beings. we live impoverished, repetitious, unrewarding lives and blame our partners for our unhappiness. The story also teaches us that we are prisoners of the fear of change. When I ask couples to risk new behaviors, they become angry with me. There is a part of them that would rather divorce, break up the family, and divide up all their possessions than acquire a new style of relating. Like the Israelites, they tremble in front of the Red Sea, even though the way lies open to them. Later, when they are in a difficult stretch of the journey, their emotional difficulties seem like hordes of pursuing Egyptians and 7-foot-tall monsters. But unlike the case of the Israelites, the enemy is within. It's the denied and repressed parts of their being, threatening to come to awareness. The final truth in the story of Moses is that we expect life's rewards to come to us easily and without sacrifice. Just as the Israelites wanted the promised land to be the Garden of Eden, God's ready-made gift to Adam and Eve, we want the simple act of getting married to cure all our ills. We want to live in a fairy tale where the beautiful princess meets the handsome prince and they live happily ever after. But it was only when the Israelites saw the promised land as an opportunity, as a chance to create a new reality, that they were allowed to enter. And it is only when we see love relationships as a vehicle for change and self-growth that we can begin to satisfy our unconscious yearnings. What lies ahead? This chapter marks a turning point in the book. Up until now, I've been describing the unconscious partnership, a relationship characterized by old brain reactivity. In the rest of the book, I will explain how to transform your partnership into a more conscious, growth-producing relationship. Here's an overview of what lies ahead. Chapter 7 explores an old-fashioned idea, commitment, and explains why it is a necessary precondition for emotional growth. Chapter 8 shows you how to turn your relationship into a zone of safety, a safe and secure environment that rekindles the intimacy of romantic love. Chapter 9 gives you some techniques for gathering more information about you and your partner. Chapter 10 explores the paradoxical idea that the only way to satisfy your childhood needs is to commit yourself wholeheartedly to the satisfaction of your partner's needs. Chapter 11 talks about creating a deep sense of connection by eliminating negativity from your relationship. Chapter 12 is an interview with two couples who are well on the way to creating a conscious partnership. Part 3 contains a series of exercises that will help you translate all the insights you have gained in parts 1 and 2 into practical, growth-producing behaviors. It is important that you finish parts 1 and 2 before you do the exercises. They will be more meaningful to you once you understand the theories behind them. Chapter 7. Commitment. From Denis de Rougemont. A life allied with mine for the rest of our lives. That is the miracle of marriage. When a couple walks into my office for their first counseling session, I know little or nothing about them. All I know with any certainty is that they have lost the vital connection between them and are mired somewhere in the power struggle. They might be anywhere along that tortuous path. They might be newlyweds, reeling from the shock of discovering that they have married the wrong person. They might be a middle-aged couple trying to cope with the stress of having 2 careers, teenage children, and a relationship that has degenerated into a series of ongoing battles. They might be an older couple who have lost all feeling for each other and are contemplating a friendly divorce. But whatever their circumstances, I can rightly assume that they have journeyed past the romantic stage of relationship and become embroiled in conflict. They have lost something, they want it back, and they don't know how to get it. Years ago, my approach, and the approach of many of my colleagues, was immediately to wade into the details of the power struggle. In the first few sessions, I would determine whether a couple's main problems seemed to be with communication, sex, money, parenting, role expectations, alcohol or drug dependency, and so on. Over the course of the next few months, I would help them gain insight into these problems. An important part of the therapeutic process was teaching them to communicate their feelings more directly. Tell Mary how you felt when she said that. Or turn to George and explain why you hung up the phone on him. At the end of each session, I would help them negotiate a contract that would specify a course of action. George, for example, would agree to give Mary 1 compliment a day, and Mary would agree to express her anger in words instead of withdrawing in silence. This was standard, problem-oriented, conflict-resolving, contractual relationship counseling. Many therapists still employ these techniques. The couples learned a lot about each other in the time that we spent together, and they became more skilled at communication. But to my dismay, few of them were able to transcend the power struggle. Instead of arguing about the issues that brought them into therapy, they were now arguing about who had violated which contract first. At times, it seemed as though my function as a therapist was merely to quantify and formalize their conflicts. My work was being supervised in those early days, and I would share my frustration with my advisor. What was I doing wrong? Why were my couples making such slow progress? All I seemed to be doing was giving people something new to fight over. My advisor would smile knowingly and then chide me for having a vested interest in whether or not my clients were able to change. If they wanted to change, he assured me, they would. Perhaps I was confusing my agenda with theirs. My role, he reminded me, was to teach people communication skills, help them gain insight into their problems, and let them go on their way. It was several years before I discovered that relationship therapy cannot dwell on surface issues like money and roles and sexual incompatibility. Underneath these superficial problems is a much larger issue. As one woman told me, my husband and I had a bigger fight going on than other therapists could help us with. We couldn't put the problem into words, and they couldn't see it. But it was the fuel that ignited all our smaller conflicts. This larger problem my client was referring to is common to most couples who seek relationship therapy. Many people experience a ruptured connection in childhood. By this I mean that their caregivers failed to satisfy their primal needs, especially their needs for safety and for a secure parent-child bond. Years later, when they have an intimate partner, a similar rupture can begin to split apart their present-day love relationship. They no longer feel a sense of connection with their partner, and oftentimes the partner has experienced the same ruptured connection, causing both parties to spend their time criticizing each other, rather than being helpmates and friends. Better communication skills and behavioral contracts are not going to provide the longed-for bridge to connection. I began to realize that I had to look at relationship therapy in a different way. While mulling it over, I recalled the words of Harry Stack Sullivan, a psychiatrist who wrote The Interpersonal Theory of Psychiatry in the 1950s. Sullivan said, "It does not matter so much what happens inside an individual. What matters is what happens between them. I discussed this idea with Helen, and she reminded me that Martin Buber, a Jewish mystical theologian, has a similar philosophy. In his famous book, I, Thou, written in the same decade as Stack's theory, Buber made it clear that his interest was not so much on the I and the thou, as on the hyphen between the two words, which he called the sacred between. According to Buber, all life is meeting. As I reflected on Sullivan and Buber, a light bulb went on in my head. When I worked with couples, I was going to need to shift my attention away from the nature of the conflict between the two individuals to the quality of the relationship between them. Only then could I help them create a safe and stable connection. Once they became secure in this new relationship, they could begin to heal the ruptured connection they had experienced decades ago with their caregivers. Armed with this knowledge, I began to work with couples more intensively, spending less time with the surface phenomena and more time focusing on the ruptured connection between the two parties. As the couples began shifting their focus away from demanding that their existing relationship meet all of their needs to focusing on what their relationship needed from them, they began to make remarkable progress. The need for commitment. Viewing couples from this new relationship paradigm, I quickly learned that one of the necessary first steps was to ask both partners to commit to the therapy process. One of the first rules was that they had to agree to come to me for at least 12 consecutive sessions. Barring genuine emergencies, they were to orchestrate their lives so that they came to each and every appointment. The reason I asked for a 12-session commitment was that I knew from my own experience and from statistical surveys that a majority of couples quit therapy before their 5th appointment. Interestingly, this is about the time it takes for unconscious issues to begin to emerge, which often triggers anxiety. As we know, a tried and true method for reducing anxiety is avoidance. Some couples react to their anxiety by claiming that therapy is making matters worse, and they fire the therapist. Others claim that they can't find time to keep their appointments. A 12-session commitment helps nip this avoidance behavior in the bud. However, this does not mean that 12 sessions are enough for all couples. Those who are the most deeply conflicted might have to work with me for a year or longer. But at the very least, I had the assurance that the two partners would stay with me long enough to work through their initial resistance, weather their anxiety, and become fully involved in the therapy process. When you are working on the exercise section of this book, you may also experience a reluctance to complete the process. Some exercises will be easy for you, even fun. But others will give you new information about yourself and challenge you to grow and change. As you do the more demanding exercises, the temptation will be to put the book aside or alter the instructions. It is precisely at these moments that you need to commit yourself wholeheartedly to the process. You will discover that if before you begin, you make a strong commitment to finish all of the exercises and do them exactly as prescribed, it will be easier to overcome your resistance. My second order of business with couples is to help them define their relationship vision. Before I hear all the things they don't like about their relationship, I want to know how they would prefer it to be. What would it be like if they lived in the relationship of their dreams? Defining the vision turns their energy away from past and present disappointments toward a more hopeful future. Achieving their vision is the goal of therapy. It is surprisingly easy for couples to create this vision, even couples who are in a great deal of turmoil. To get them started, I ask them to list a series of positive statements, beginning with the word "we," that describe the kind of relationship they would like to have. They are to frame these statements in the present tense, as if the future were already here. Here are some examples. We enjoy each other's company. We are financially secure. We spend time together doing things we both enjoy. In just one work session, they are able to define their separate visions, isolate the common elements, and combine these elements into a shared goal. Once the vision is defined, I ask them to read it daily as a form of meditation. Gradually, through the process of repetition, the vision becomes embedded in their subconscious. The commitment agreement. As soon as the work on the vision is completed, which is usually about the second or third session, I ask couples to make a second commitment, and that is to stay together for the initial 12 weeks of therapy. The reason for this is obvious. Relationship therapy isn't possible if there is no relationship to work on. For 3 months, they are not to separate, nor to end the relationship in a more catastrophic way, such as by suicide, murder, or insanity. Although separation and divorce are by far the most common ways my clients contemplate terminating their relationships, a significant minority have had a feeling that they might go crazy. And there have been several couples who fantasized about more violent options. I call the decision to close all 4 of these escape routes the commitment agreement. When you get to part 3, you will see that this decision is one of the first exercises you will be asked to perform. Fuser-isolator dynamics. The 2 members of a love relationship often react to the commitment to stay together in opposite ways. Typically, one partner feels relieved, the other feels threatened. The one who feels relieved is usually the fuser in the relationship, the one who grew up with an unsatisfied need for attachment. The one who feels threatened is the isolator, the one who has an unsatisfied need for autonomy. The reason the fuser is relieved by the commitment is that the guarantee of a stable relationship, if only for 3 months, reduces the unconscious fear of abandonment. For the fuser, this fear always lurks beneath the surface, but it is more acute in a troubled relationship. The reason the decision to stay together makes the isolator feel apprehensive is that it closes an important escape hatch, triggering the isolator's archaic fear of absorption. Thus, the commitment agreement tends to alleviate fear in one partner and exacerbate it in the other. During the period of this agreement, I try to ease the anxiety of the clients who feel trapped. I remind them that the commitment is only for 3 months, and at the end of that time, they are free to make other decisions. Because we are dealing with a finite amount of time, most people find they can cope. Furthermore, I explain that agreeing to stay together tends to make their partners less clingy or invasive. One of the reasons your partner is so needy of your attention, I explain to the isolator, is that you are not emotionally available. When you stay together and work on your relationship, your partner's fear of abandonment will begin to go away, and your partner won't feel the same need to chase after you. Ironically, by making an agreement to stay within the relationship for 3 months, the isolator can end up with more psychic space than before. A couple's response to the decision to stay together is a fascinating glimpse of more complex fuser-isolator dynamics. Most of the time, 2 partners in a love relationship push against an invisible boundary in an attempt to satisfy their dual needs for autonomy and attachment. Typically, each individual fixates on one of those needs. One person habitually advances in an effort to satisfy unmet needs for attachment. The other habitually retreats in an effort to satisfy unmet needs for autonomy. Some couples stay locked in this particular dance step for the duration of their relationship. Others experience a startling reversal. For a variety of reasons, the person who typically advances begins to retreat. The partner who habitually retreats turns around in amazement. Where's the pursuer? To everyone's surprise, the isolator suddenly discovers an unmet need for closeness. The pattern is reversed, like the flip-flop of magnetic poles. And now the isolator does the pursuing. It's as if all couples collude to maintain a set distance between them. If one person starts encroaching on the other's territory, the other has to back away. If one person starts vacating the territory, the other has to pursue. As with a pair of magnets with like charges facing each other, there's an invisible force field keeping couples a critical distance apart. There is not enough safety in their relationship for them to feel comfortable being more closely connected.